Now, how does he do it? Well, I don't know about you, but you can buy about 600 books on Amazon about how to hear God. And after reading them all, I would have hoped that you could hear God maybe once or twice. But actually, here's a question. Is it that we're trying to hear God striving in our flesh when we should be trying to hear God through our spirit? You're not sure about that? 1 Corinthians 2 talks about hearing God. It starts from verse 9. So, is it that we're striving for the big signs? We're striving for this big crash, this big moment where God breaks through and these two words are spoken. And we're looking, like Elijah did, for the fire and for the wind and for the big whirlwind, the moment of huge kind of calamity where God breaks in and speaks and the world shakes and everything else. Or should we be trying to listen for the still small voice? Now, I've got something that spoke to me about all of this. Do you know the road to Emmaus? Luke 24. Luke 24, it starts about verse 15. There's this story. And Jesus died. He's risen again from the dead, but they're not quite sure. They don't recognize him in the same way because his body's been transformed into the kind of the likeness of what we're all going to end up with, which is kind of fun. Basically, Jesus is walking along with these fellas. They don't know it's Jesus. And they're chatting away to him, and Jesus is basically talking about the scriptures and the resurrection and unfolding it all. And I would have loved these guys to have written it all down, this whole conversation. And it gets to the end, and he breaks bread with them, and suddenly their eyes are opened, and they realize it's Jesus, and then Jesus disappears. It's kind of like, oh, we're just going to chat to you now. But God was with them the whole time. And they didn't realize it was him. But they realized it was him afterwards, because the way they heard him was, didn't our hearts burn within us as he unfolded the scriptures? And it's got this moment of presence and word and how God speaks into us and our hearts get moved, they get burned. It's kind of this moment of, there's something going on in my life and I need to shift this, I need to move this. So sometimes when God challenges us about sin in our lives, there's this moment of, I've got to get this out, I've got to burn it away, I've got to get rid of it. When sometimes God speaks to us and unfolds something about the world that we're living in, our family or otherwise, and we get a passion for something, there's this thing that rises up within us, this spiritual aspect of us that's burning within, which is like, this has got to change. We've got to do something. We've got to move this. We've got to get this thing out the way. So there's this that comes up. Sometimes it will be God speaking within us through this passionate transformation of our spirits and driving us into action. That's where your ears are when it comes to your spirit. So where is God moving you? Where is God shaping you? See, this builds our faith, it stirs our hearts, it creates hope, love, faith. It stimulates dreams and visions and brings life to us. So as Christians, you know this. You know, when you come along to the church and you're hearing about purpose and new opportunities and new ministries and everything else, and many of you are talking about how great that is and you're being stirred up inside, that thing that's being stirred up inside you is the voice of God calling you. It is. It's that, I've got to do this. I'm getting excited. And that's what you plug into. If you throw it away and you dull your ears to it and everything else, it will die down over time because that's the enemy robbing it away. But if you grasp that moment and you pivot on it and you think, my life is going to change forever because God has spoken to me, then that's the point where you begin to shift your direction. You go and walk with God and the presence will walk with you as you're on the road to Emmaus. Fascinating how it works and how it all goes. I've got a few minutes and I've got to preach. I hope you don't mind me running over a teeny bit. Is that all right? Cain and Abel story, Genesis 4. Feel free to turn to it. I'm just going to kind of paraphrase as I go, if that's okay. Do forgive me. Let me ask a question. How does God hear? How does God hear? There's a bit in the Bible when Jesus talks about prayer, and there's two guys praying. One of them stands up and he says, "Oh, Lord, we beseech thee." And he goes through this whole long list. And he's talking about how great he is and how terrible that man is and how da-da-da-da-da-da. And then the next man stands up and he says, "I'm a tax collector, I'm a sinner, I'm a wreck of a life." He opens up his heart to God and God hears him. Why? Because God hears your heart. He doesn't necessarily hear the words that come out of your mouth. See, God's ears are tuned to your spirit, not to the words that necessarily come out of your mouth. Or they will remind you of them sometimes, but he's heard them in a different context. It's interesting that if you read the Cain and Abel story, I'll just zoom in on one part. There's a bit in Cain and Abel where Cain's slain Abel. Abel's gone out to meet Cain in his field because his brother's a bit upset because God hasn't received his sacrifice. And Cain's really jealous of Abel. It's a kid's story. And so Abel's in Cain's field, and Cain just slays him like that, gets him, and he's dead. And he probably buries him or tries to hide the body or something like that. And God comes up to Cain, and he said, where's your brother? Am I my brother's keeper? And God says something fascinating. He says, I have heard the cry of your brother's blood from the field. I've heard the blood. Now, if any of you are medics and you put a stethoscope on and you listen to somebody's heart, you can hear the blood moving because you hear the valves. And sometimes you can hear a bit of the turbulence of the blood, and that turbulence can give you indication of something wrong or otherwise. Also, as a medic, you can test blood, and I won't go into the details, and so you can find out if there's anything wrong going on in the system, and there's all sorts of bits and pieces. So blood can speak in that way. But God hears it in a slightly different way. God hears blood by what the blood is crying out from. He hears blood when it comes to oppression. He hears blood when something has been spilled, something has been done, when sin has manifested itself and harmed an individual, and he hears that. So if anybody has ever been completely uninterested in you and it's wounded you and scarred you, God heard your heart. If anybody has passed you over and completely ignored you because they had other things to do, God heard the cry of your heart. If anybody treated you as being unimportant, wrote you off as not good enough and pathetic and never going to make it in life, God heard the harm that was caused in your heart. If anybody has been so obsessed with being heard that they wouldn't allow you to speak, so obsessed with being in the limelight that they would push you down on a regular basis, God heard you being thrown to the floor. If anybody was completely impotent from healing because of the problems they had, like a mother or a father, and they never brought you up in the way they should, God heard the cry of the child. If any of you was being unable to be understood, you tried and tried and tried and tried, and the person would not understand you and would not understand you and would not understand you, like a bad husband when the wife is trying to cry in pain, God hears the cry of the blood that is being spilled. And if anybody tries to twist what you say and read into it, like sometimes happens, God hears your pain, hears your cry. I don't know about you. Have you ever prayed one of those prayers where you just couldn't speak? I've done it now and again. I've done it in hospitals. I've done it in youth work. Where something's gone on, and I've come to the end of everything I can do, and there's nothing more I can say, there's nothing more I can do, and you've kind of crawled into your prayer area again, and you're crying, and you don't know what to say anymore, and there's this thing that comes out of you, which is just pain. And you just cry inside, and it's kind of... And there's nothing that comes out because there's this cry from your heart. He hears that. That's the prayer he hears. Those are the cries of the oppressed. That's the cry of the Israelites that he heard when he sent Moses. That's the cry that he hears. So some of you here are at that point, yeah, where the job... it's not going to happen. And you're like, I've given and given and given and tried and tried and tried. And it's just... Some of you, it's your family. Some of it's your kids. Some of it's your husband or your wife. Some of you, it's just life in general has reached a point where you're giving up. And it's this cries coming out to God. And it's coming out from a field where somebody has spilled it. And there are people that are walking past and they're saying, well, I'm okay. I'm living my own life, and I'm not interested in what's going on there. See, Abel's blood was spilled in his brother's field. This story of Cain and Abel is similar to the story of Jesus, and we often relate it in the scriptures. It's in Hebrews. It talks about how Abel is a bit like Christ, and that Jesus came and spilled his blood in our field, and how we as sinners were the oppressors, and how Christ's blood cried out on the sinner's behalf. So when you can't speak, and when your prayer goes up to heaven, it's Christ's blood that cries out for you. His blood that was spilled in our field cries out for every person who's oppressed, every sinner, every single one of us. In fact, when we cried out to the Lord and he heard us, it was Christ's blood that cried first. So for those that are struggling with addictions, still struggling with sin, problems in your relationship, being a bad dad, being a bad kid, otherwise, his blood cries out to God for your soul and your forgiveness. It does. It screams to God with that cry of, for you. And that's what Christianity is about. It's about Christ dying, his blood being shed in our field, so that the blood from the field cries out to God so that he reaches down to save you. And he comes to remove you from sin, remove you from the oppression, remove you from death, and to save you and to bring you to a point of wholeness.